My name is Zara and I am 28. To understand the weight of what happened on the night of my 28th birthday, you first have to understand the architecture of my family. For most people, a home is a sanctuary. But for me, it was a high-stakes theater where I was the only one without a script and the only one destined to lose. My parents, Arthur and Eleanor, are people of significant social standing and even more significant cruelty. They view life as a series of power dynamics, and for nearly 3 decades, I was their favorite tool for consolidation. They didn't just want a daughter, they wanted to fool someone whose perceived failures could make their own polished lives shine a bit brighter by comparison. Growing up, the air in our house was always thin, as if they were sucking all the oxygen out of the room just to see if I would collapse. If I got a B, I was a disappointment. If I got an A, I was told it was the bare minimum. By the time I reached my late 20s, I had carved out a life for myself that was quiet and independent. But I still carried the phantom limb of their approval. I work as a forensic accountant, a job that requires an obsession with detail and a stomach for finding the rot hidden beneath beautiful surfaces. It was a job they looked down upon, calling it being counting for the unimaginative. 3 weeks before my birthday, the invitations started going out. Not from me, of course, but from Eleanor. She called me with a voice like silk over shattered glass, telling me that they wanted to host a formal dinner at the estate to celebrate my 28th year. She claimed they wanted to make amends for the distance between us. I knew better than to trust the sentiment, but there's a specific kind of hope that never quite dies, no matter how many times you try to bury it. I agreed to go, thinking perhaps the milestone of nearly being 30 had finally softened their edges. The night of the party was stiflingly humid. The driveway was lined with luxury cars belonging to their inner circle local politicians, developers, and socialites who thrived on the same brand of polished malice my parents practiced. I smoothed down my dress, took a deep breath, and walked inside. The house smelled of expensive lilies and floor wax. Everyone was there, holding crystal flutes of champagne, their eyes tracking me like predators watching a limping gazelle. My father clapped me on the shoulder, his grip a little too tight, his smile never reaching his eyes. He told me I looked tired, a classic Arthur opening move designed to unsettle me before the first course was even served. Dinner was a masterclass in passive aggression. My mother made sure to seat me next to a man who had recently bought out a firm I had been auditing, and she spent the evening loudly discussing the successes of my cousins while asking me if I was still living in that little apartment. The table laughed at her jokes, and I felt the familiar heat rising in my neck. But I stayed seated. I played the part of the dutiful, quiet daughter. I watched as my brother, the golden child who had never worked a day in his life, but managed to spend a fortune of my father's money, pulled out his phone and started recording the table. He said he wanted to capture the memories. I saw my mother glance at my father and nod. That was the signal. The lights dimmed, and the room fell into a practiced silence. The catering staff emerged from the kitchen, but they weren't carrying a standard tiered cake. They were carrying a large, heavy platter covered by a silver cloakie. My father stood up, gesturing for everyone to focus their attention on me. He spoke about how some children grow up to be leaders, and some grow up to be lessons. He said tonight was about celebrating the truth of who I was. When the cloakie was lifted, there was no frosting, no candles, and no sweetness. It was a dense, gray slab of what looked like industrial fondant, shaped to look like a tombstone. Written across the front in stark, black icing were the words, "Congratulations on another year of being pathetic." The room erupted. It wasn't just a chuckle or a polite titter. It was a roar of orchestrated mockery. My brother moved closer with his phone, angling the camera to catch the exact moment my spirit broke. My mother leaned back in her chair, a glass of wine at her lips, her eyes dancing with the thrill of the kill. They were all waiting for the tears. They were waiting for me to scream, to run out crying, to give them the viral moment of humiliation they clearly felt I deserved for the crime of being myself. I looked at the cake. I looked at the black icing bleeding into the gray base. I felt a strange, cold clarity wash over me. For years, I had searched for the missing pieces of our relationship, trying to figure out why they hated me so much. In that moment, staring at that cruel, expensive joke, I realized it didn't matter why. The only thing that mattered was that the debt was finally settled. I didn't need to love them anymore. Because you cannot love or void, I didn't cry. I didn't even flinch. I felt a small, sharp smile tug at the corners of my mouth. I reached out, dipped a finger into the black icing, and tasted it. It was bitter, just like them. I looked up at the sea of faces, all of them illuminated by the glow of recording phone screens. Thank you, I said, my voice steady and echoing in the sudden hush. This is exactly what I needed to see tonight. You have no idea how much clarity this gives me. I stood up slowly, smoothing the wrinkles from my skirt. The laughter died down, replaced by a confused murmuring. This wasn't the reaction they had rehearsed. My father frowned, his brow furrowing as he realized he had lost control of the narrative. Eleanor's hand froze midair. I didn't wait for them to speak. I turned away from the table and began the long walk toward the foyer. My heels clicked rhythmically on the marble, a countdown they couldn't hear. As I reached the massive mahogany front doors, I felt my father's heavy footsteps behind me. He was angry now, his pride wounded because I hadn't given him the satisfaction of my public collapse. Where do you think you're going, Zara? He hissed, loud enough for the guests in the dining room to hear. You can't just walk away from your own party. We spent a lot of money on this. You're being ungrateful. You've always been ungrateful. I stopped and turned. He was standing there, framed by the opulence of a house built on secrets and lies, looking every bit the powerful patriarch he pretended to be. My mother and brother were hovering in the archway, their phones still clutched in their hands, recording what they thought was the final act of my defeat. I looked him straight in the eye. I didn't feel fear. I didn't feel sadness. I felt the weight of the folders I had been compiling for the last 18 months, the digital paper trail of offshore accounts, the forged signatures on the development permits, and the systematic embezzlement from the charitable trust Eleanor used to bolster her social standing. I had been waiting for a reason to stop being a daughter and start being a professional. They had just handed me that reason on a silver platter. I leaned in close to him, so close I could smell the expensive scotch on his breath and the desperation beneath his cologne. I spoke 3 words, loud enough for the microphone on my brother's phone to pick up, and clear enough to ensure they would never sleep soundly again. Check your mail, I said. The blood drained from my father's face so fast it was as if a plug had been pulled. He didn't know exactly what I had found, but he knew what he had hidden. He knew that for 18 months, his daughter, the pathetic bean counter, had been the one person with total access to the ghosts in his closet. I didn't wait to see the expression on my mother's face or hear the sound of my brother dropping his phone. I walked out into the humid night air, the heavy doors thudding shut behind me, leaving them in a silence that was about to become very, very loud. The drive away from the estate was the most peaceful moment of my entire life. The headlights of my car sliced through the thick darkness of the countryside, carving a path toward a future where the names Arthur and Eleanor no longer carried the weight of law. I could still see my father's face in my rearview mirror, a mask of frozen arrogance melting into pure, unadulterated terror. He knew. He didn't know the specifics yet, but a man who builds an empire on shifting sand is always listening for the sound of the first grain slipping. I had just handed him a landslide. I reached my apartment and sat in the dark for a long time, the silence a stark contrast to the cacophony of the party. My phone was blowing up. My brother, Julian, was calling incessantly. My mother was sending a barrage of texts that shifted wildly in tone from demanding an apology for my rudeness to begging me to come back and talk like a family. They were spiraling. That was the beauty of the 3 words I had chosen. I didn't tell them what I had done. I told them where to look. The anticipation of a blow is often more agonizing than the strike itself. I opened my laptop. As a forensic accountant, My mind works in grids and ledgers. I see the world as a series of balances that must eventually level out. For 28 years, my family had been withdrawing from my soul, leaving me in a permanent state of emotional deficit. Tonight, I was simply closing the account. I looked at the final folder on my desktop, labeled Project Inheritance. It contained everything. It started a year and a half ago when I was asked to do a cursory audit for one of my father's shell companies as a favor. He thought I was too stupid or too loyal to see the discrepancies. He thought my eyes would skim over the rounded numbers and the peculiar timing of the wire transfers to a boutique bank in the Cayman Islands. But numbers have a language, and they were screaming at me. My father wasn't just wealthy, he was a thief. He had been siphoning funds from the municipal pension fund he helped manage, moving small enough amounts that they went unnoticed by the standard bots, but large enough to fund the very lifestyle they used to make me feel small. Even worse was my mother's involvement. Her beloved Foundation for Arts and Literacy was nothing more than a laundromat. She would host these gala dinners, much like the one I just left, and the donations would disappear into a maze of nonprofits that eventually led back to her personal shopping accounts in Paris and Milan. They were a team of predators, and they had spent my entire life making me feel like the weak link in a strong chain, when in reality, I was the only thing in that house that wasn't a lie. I hit send on a pre-timed email. It was addressed to the lead investigator at the Securities and Exchange Commission, a man I had worked with on 3 previous cases. He knew my work was impeccable. Attached were the spreadsheets, the encrypted communications I had recovered from their home server, and the scanned images of the dual ledgers my father kept in a floor safe he thought I didn't know the combination to. He had used my birthday as his combination for years, the one day he claimed to care about. It was the ultimate irony. By 3:00 a.m., the calls stopped. I imagined they had finally checked the mail, not the physical mailbox at the end of their long, winding driveway, but the digital inbox of their primary corporate counsel. I had sent a courtesy copy of the filing to their lawyer, a man named Marcus, who had spent his career cleaning up Arthur's messes. I wanted him to know that this time, there wasn't enough bleach in the world to get the stains out. The next morning, the sun rose with a cold, pale light. I didn't go to work. I sat on my balcony with a cup of black coffee and waited. I didn't have to wait long. At 8:00 a.m., the news broke. It wasn't a headline yet, but the ripples were moving through the financial sectors. My father's firm issued a vague statement about a voluntary internal review. By noon, the FBI had arrived at the estate. I watched the footage on a local news stream. The same driveway that had been filled with luxury cars the night before was now blocked by black SUVs. I saw my mother being led out of the house. She wasn't wearing her designer silk or her pearls. She was in a tracksuit, her hair uncharacteristically messy, clutching a designer handbag as if it could save her. She looked small. For the first time in my life, she didn't look like a giant. She looked like a woman who had been caught with her hand in a bowl that didn't belong to her. My father was next. He tried to maintain his dignity, chin held high, barking orders at the agents, but I could see the way his knees shook. He looked toward the cameras, perhaps hoping to find a friendly face in the media. But all he found were lenses recording his downfall. He had spent his life filming my failures, recording my tears to show the world how pathetic I was. Now, the world was returning the favor. Julian, my brother, was the only one who didn't get arrested that day, mostly because he was too insignificant to be part of the crime. He was just a parasite who lived off the host. I saw him standing on the porch, looking lost, holding his phone, the same phone he had used to record that tombstone cake. I wondered if he was still filming. I wondered if he realized that the money for his car, his clothes, and his lifestyle was currently being frozen by a federal judge. My phone buzzed. It was a text from a restricted number. I knew it was my father using a lawyer's phone. It said, "Why, we gave you everything." I didn't reply. There was no point. They would never understand. that everything they gave me was bought with someone else's future. They would never understand that the most expensive gift they ever gave me was the realization that I didn't need them. They had spent my 28th birthday trying to convince me I was pathetic. But as I watched the agents carry boxes of evidence out of their front door, I realized I had never felt more powerful. I spent the afternoon cleaning my apartment. It felt symbolic. I was scrubbing away the last of the grime they had left on my life. Every time I thought about that cake, I smelled. It was the best thing they could have done. If they had been kind, if they had given me a real party and told me they were proud of me, I might have hesitated. I might have deleted the files. I might have protected them out of a misplaced sense of loyalty. But they had pushed me one last time. And in doing so, they had pushed me right over the finish line. The revenge wasn't just about the jail time or the loss of their money. It was about the destruction of their image. For people like Arthur and Eleanor, their reputation was their air. I had just sucked the oxygen out of their room. I wanted them to feel the thinness of the air I had been breathing for years. I wanted them to know that the person they despised was the one who held their entire world in her hands and chose to let it drop. By evening, the socialites who had been laughing at the dinner table were already scrubbing their social media of any photos with my parents. The politicians were returning donations. The development deals were collapsing like a house of cards. The special birthday dinner was now the last supper of their social lives. I sat back and watched the world burn, feeling the warmth of the fire. I knew the road ahead would be long. There would be depositions, trials, and a media circus. They would try to blame me, to paint me as a disgruntled daughter out for blood. But I had the receipts. Literally, every penny they stole was documented. Every lie they told was backed up by data. You can argue with a person, but you cannot argue with a ledger. The numbers don't lie, and they don't have feelings. They just balance. I looked at my reflection in the window. I didn't see the pathetic girl they wanted me to be. I saw a woman who had survived a lifelong war and finally won the decisive battle. I was Zara. I was 28. And for the first time in my life, I was free. I picked up my phone and blocked every single one of their numbers. I didn't need to hear their screams. The silence of my apartment was the only sound I wanted to hear. But the story wasn't over. My parents were survivors in their own twisted way. And I knew they would try to fight back from the corner I had backed them into. They didn't realize that I was 3 steps ahead of them. While they were worrying about the SEC and the FBI, I was already looking into the deeper, darker corners of their business, the parts they hadn't even told Marcus. If they wanted to play a game of who could be the most cold-blooded, I was ready to show them that I was their daughter after all. I had learned from the best. I sat down at my desk, the glow of the screen illuminating my face. There was one more account I needed to look into, an account that didn't have my father's name on it, but had my mother's fingerprints all over it. It involved a property in the south of France that had never appeared on any tax return. It was time to go back to work. The property in the south of France was more than just a vacation home. It was a fortress of secrets. My mother, Eleanor, had always been obsessed with the idea of a legacy that transcended borders. She wanted to be a woman of the world, a phantom whose influence was felt in every capital of Europe. While my father was busy with his crude embezzlements and municipal thefts, my mother was playing a much more sophisticated game. She was using a network of art galleries and high-end real estate to move wealth into assets that were historically difficult to track. But she had made one fatal mistake. She had used me as a passive signatory, a shell company, when I turned 18, a company she thought I would never investigate. I spent the next 48 hours submerged in a sea of digital ink. The pathetic daughter they mocked was now a ghost in their machines. I found the transfers that linked the French villa to a series of art auctions where the prices were inflated by 300%. It was a classic money laundering scheme, using the subjective value of contemporary art to clean the dirty money coming out of my father's municipal accounts. They were a perfect ecosystem of corruption. He stole the water, and she filtered it through culture until it came out sparkling on the other side. The walls were closing in on them back at the estate. My father was out on a massive bail bond, his assets frozen except for a small stipend his lawyers managed to claw back. My mother was under house arrest, her passport confiscated. The news was a constant stream of their disgrace. I watched a clip of a reporter asking my father about the pathetic cake, which had leaked to the press thanks to an anonymous tip I may or may not have facilitated. The public, who had once envied them, now loathed them. There is nothing the world loves more than a fallen idol, especially one that turns out to be a bully. I received a call from Marcus, their lead counsel, on the third day. His voice was no longer the confident baritone of a man who owned every room he walked into. He sounded weary, like a man trying to hold back the ocean with a plastic bucket. "Zara," he said, not using my title or greeting. "Your father wants to make a deal. He says if you pull back, if you stop feeding the investigators these specific breadcrumbs, he will sign over the remaining trust funds to you. He'll give you everything that's left. He just wants this to go away." I leaned back in my chair, looking at the screen where I had just decrypted a file containing the true deed to the French property. "Marcus," I replied, my voice as cold as a winter morning. "Tell him that he's still thinking like a businessman. He thinks everything has a price. He doesn't realize that I'm not selling. I'm not a creditor looking for a payout. I'm the auditor who found the books were cooked, and I'm closing the restaurant. Tell him the trust funds are already being seized by the SEC anyway. He's trying to sell me a burning house." There was a long silence on the other end. I could hear him shuffling papers. "He's your father, Zara," Marcus said, a last-ditch effort to appeal to a morality I had long since discarded in that house. "And I was his daughter on my birthday." I reminded him, and he gave me a tombstone. "Tell him I'm just finishing what he started." I hung up. The satisfaction wasn't a hot flare of anger. It was a deep, steady hum of justice. I turned my attention back to the French villa. I didn't want the money. I wanted the total erasure of their pride. I found the final piece of the puzzle. The villa wasn't just a house. It was being used as collateral for a private loan to a very dangerous group of offshore investors. If the villa was seized by the French authorities, which I was currently ensuring would happen by flagging the suspicious transaction history to the French finance ministry, those investors would lose their collateral, and they weren't the type of people who would be satisfied with a gray cake and a laugh. I spent the afternoon drafting a comprehensive report for the European authorities. I included the signatures my mother had forged, the dates of the transfers, and the GPS coordinates of the safe hidden behind a fake pantry in the villa's kitchen. I knew about the safe because I had overheard her bragging about it during one of her many wine-soaked dinners, when she thought I was upstairs doing homework. I had always been listening. That was their biggest mistake. They assumed that because I was quiet, I was emptied out by the time I hit send on the final batch of evidence. I felt a physical weight lift off my shoulders. The architecture of their destruction was complete. It was a beautiful, symmetrical structure. My father would face the American courts for his greed, and my mother would face the international authorities for her vanity. Julian, the golden boy, would simply fade into the background, a man with no skills and no money, forced to live the pathetic life they had projected onto me. I took a moment to look at my social media. The video of the cake had gone viral. It was being used as a symbol of toxic parenting across the globe. The "congratulations on another year of being pathetic" line had backfired so spectacularly that it was now a meme used to mock the arrogant. My parents had wanted to film my humiliation to keep as a private trophy. Instead, they had provided the evidence for their own public execution. I received one last message from my mother that evening. It was a voice note. Her voice was cracked, the elegance stripped away to reveal the panic animal beneath. "Zara, please," she sobbed. "They're taking the house. They're taking everything. I have nowhere to go. We were only trying to toughen you up. We wanted you to be strong like us. Please, tell them you made it up. Tell them it was a mistake. We're family. We're all we have. I listened to it twice. I didn't feel a flicker of guilt. Toughen me up. They had spent years trying to soften me so they could mold me into whatever version of a servant they needed that day. They didn't want me to be strong. They wanted me to be broken so I would never leave. Well, I was strong now, strong enough to watch them lose everything and not blink. I deleted the voice note. I didn't need to keep the sounds of her despair. I had the memory of her laughter at that dinner table, and that was enough to fuel me for a lifetime. I walked over to my window and looked out at the city. The lights were twinkling like diamonds scattered on black velvet. For the first time, I felt like I belonged among them. I wasn't the girl in the shadows anymore. I was the one who had brought the light. The next morning, the news reported that my mother had been taken into custody for questioning regarding international financial crimes. The French government had issued a red notice. My father had suffered a minor heart attack from the stress, though the doctors said he would recover just in time to stand trial. The empire was gone. The estate was being liquidated. Even the furniture was being tagged for auction. I thought about that cake one last time. It had been meant to be my final meal as their victim. Instead, it was the first meal of my new life. They had expected me to cry, to beg for their love, to stay in the room and take the abuse. By walking out, I had taken their power. By saying those 3 words, I had taken their future. I poured myself a glass of wine, a good one, but with my own hard-earned money. I sat in my quiet, modest apartment and toasted to the woman I had become. I was no longer the daughter of Arthur and Eleanor. I was Zara, the forensic accountant who had balanced the books. And the balance was finally 0. If you are finding peace in this journey of justice, please subscribe to my channel, My Calm Revenge. Here, we believe that the best way to handle a bully isn't to scream back, but to quietly take away everything they use to hurt you. Your support helps me bring more of these stories to light, proving that the truth always finds a way out, no matter how much icing you use to cover it up. But as I sat there, a new email popped up. It was from an unknown sender, with a subject line that made my blood run cold. You didn't find everything, Zara. Check the basement. I didn't have a basement in my apartment, but the estate did. A basement that had been sealed off since I was a child. A basement I had been told was flooded and dangerous. My heart began to thud in my chest. Was there one more secret, one more piece of the rot that I had missed? I realized that the story wasn't quite over yet. The revenge was calm, but the roots were deeper than I ever imagined. The email stayed on my screen, a glowing white rectangle of uncertainty in my darkened room. You didn't find everything, Zara. Check the basement. My mind immediately went to the estate, the sprawling mausoleum of my childhood. There was a section of the lower level, behind the wine cellar and the industrial laundry room, that had been blocked by a heavy steel door for as long as I could remember. My father told me it was a structural hazard, a relic of a previous foundation that had failed. As a child, I believed him. As an auditor, I knew that in a house built on lies, the most reinforced door usually hides the biggest truth. I knew the FBI had already swept the house, but they were looking for paper trails and digital footprints. They were looking for the crimes of the present. They weren't looking for the ghosts of the past. I grabbed my coat and my keys. I still had my emergency key to the side entrance of the estate, or key they had forgotten to take back, because they had spent so much energy convincing themselves I was too timid to ever use it. The drive back to the estate felt like descending into a grave. The police tape fluttered in the wind, a yellow warning against the dark silhouette of the mansion. The house was empty now, the power cut, the air inside stagnant and heavy. I moved through the halls with a flashlight, the beam cutting through the dust motes like a scalpel. I descended the stairs to the basement, my breath hitching in the cold air. I reached the steel door. To my surprise, it wasn't locked. The federal agents had forced it open during their search, but had seemingly moved on when they found nothing but old crates and mechanical equipment. But I knew my father. He didn't build steel doors for old crates. I moved past the initial room, scanning the walls. I looked for the things the untrained eye misses: asymmetric flooring, a gap in the crown molding, a vent that didn't lead to a furnace. Behind a stack of moth-eaten tapestries, I found it, a keypad, hidden inside a hollowed-out brick. I tried the combination I had used for his save my birthday. It didn't work. I tried my mother's birthday. Nothing. Then, I tried the date of my grandmother's death, the only woman who had ever shown me true kindness before she passed away when I was 10. The keypad beeped, and a section of the wall groaned open. Inside was a room that looked like a high-tech archive. It wasn't filled with gold or cash. It was filled with files. Not my father's files, but files on everyone else. This was the true source of their power. It was a library of blackmail. My parents hadn't just been stealing money. They had been stealing secrets. They had dossiers on every judge, every politician, and every business rival they had ever encountered. This was why they were untouchable for so long. They weren't just rich. They were the keepers of everyone's shame. But as I began to flip through the folders, I found a drawer labeled with my name. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside were medical records, school reports, and private investigator logs that dated back to the year I was born. I realized then that my entire life had been a controlled experiment. They hadn't just been disappointed in me. They had been actively sabotaging my opportunities behind the scenes to ensure I stayed dependent on them. They had intercepted job offers, derailed my early relationships, and even paid off a professor to fail me in a crucial exam just to see if I would crawl back to them for help. The pathetic label wasn't a reflection of my character. It was a goal they had been working toward since my first breath. They wanted a captive audience for their greatness. They wanted a permanent witness to their crimes who was too broken to ever speak up. The cake at the party wasn't just an insult. It was a victory lap. They thought they had finally succeeded in extinguishing the last spark of my will. I sat on the cold floor of that secret room, surrounded by the wreckage of a life they had tried to steal from me. I felt a wave of cold fury that surpassed anything I had felt before. This was the final piece of the balance. The money was gone. The reputation was destroyed. But the truth of my own history was the only thing that could truly set me free. I didn't call the police. I didn't call Marcus. I took out my phone and started scanning. I scanned every dossier, every photo, and every ledger of leverage they had collected. I didn't want to use it for blackmail. I wanted to destroy the entire network. If I gave this to the Department of Justice, every person who had looked the other way while my father stole from the city would be implicated. The entire ecosystem of corruption that sustained people like Arthur and Eleanor would be dismantled. As I finished, I heard a floorboard creak upstairs. I turned off my flashlight and pressed myself against the cold wall. Heavy footsteps echoed through the empty house. Zara? It was my father's voice. It was weak, strained, but still carried the edge of entitlement. He must have checked himself out of the hospital against medical advice. He knew I would come here. He knew that the only thing more dangerous than a daughter who hates you is a daughter who knows why. I walked out of the secret room, the light of my phone illuminating the doorway. He was standing at the base of the basement stairs, clutching a railing for support. He looked like a ghost haunting his own ruins. "You shouldn't be here," he rasped. "That room, it's not for you. It was meant to protect us. It was meant to protect you. Protect me?" I asked, my voice echoing in the hollow space. "You spent 28 years trying to manufacture my failure. You kept a ledger of my weaknesses like they were assets. You didn't protect me, Arthur. You imprisoned me." He stepped forward, his eyes wild. "We gave you a place in this world. Without us, you're just a girl with a calculator. Give me the phone. Zara, let's talk about this. We can fix the accounts. We can start over." I looked at him, this man who had spent my birthday calling me pathetic in front of a room full of strangers. I realized he was the one who was pathetic. He was so afraid of being ordinary that he had turned his entire life into a crime scene. "It's already done," I said. "I sent the files to the DOI 5 minutes ago. The basement, the blackmail, the sabotage. It's all gone. There's nothing left to fix. The air seemed to leave his lungs. He slumped against the wall, his face gray in the dim light. He realized that for the first time in his life, he had no leverage. He had no secrets left to sell. He was just an old man in a cold basement, facing the consequences of a life spent hurting the only person who might have actually loved him. I walked past him, my shoulder brushing his. But I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I climbed the stairs, leaving him in the darkness of the room he had built to hide his sins. I walked out of the front doors of the estate, through the police tape, and into the cold night air. The next morning, the headlines didn't just talk about embezzlement. They talked about a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of the state government. The Zara files, as the media called them, sparked a firestorm of resignations and arrests. My parents were no longer just white-collar criminals. They were the center of the largest corruption scandal in a generation. My mother was extradited to France, where she would spend the next 15 years in a prison far removed from the galleries of Paris. My father, unable to handle the loss of his status and facing a lifetime behind bars, took a plea deal that required him to forfeit every single cent he had ever made. He ended up in a state-run facility, the very kind of place he used to mock. As for me, I moved. I didn't take a dime of their money, but I took something much more valuable. I took my name back. I opened my own firm, specializing in protecting whistleblowers and helping victims of corporate abuse. I used the pathetic cake as a paperweight on my desk, a reminder that what other people call your weakness is often the very thing that will make you strong enough to break them. I am Zara. I am 28, and I am no longer looking for anyone's approval. The story of my revenge wasn't just about taking down my parents. It was about building myself. I stood in the path of a landslide and didn't move. I watched the world they built crumble into dust, and from that dust, I walked away clean. The silence is no longer heavy. It's light. It's the sound of a life that finally belongs to the person living it. My parents thought they could finish me with a joke and a camera. They didn't realize that I was the one who was going to have the last laugh, and I didn't need a single person to film it. Thank you for walking through the darkness with me. If you've ever been made to feel small by the people who were supposed to make you feel safe, remember, the person with the ledger always has the final word. Like this video and share with friends. Subscribe to our channel My Calm Revenge. Don't forget to press the bell icon for more updates.